All right, my hearties, we're here today to finish off not finish off, but get the collisions in place for our catch and avoid game. And one of the things we are going to do is just check to make sure we're on the same page. So we should start off with a splash screen that goes through a few screens and should end on level 1. And just in case yours doesn't, there was an error in an earlier version of the game code in which, let's see, in which on the startup, just in case you still has this in there, on the next splash, the previous version said splash current frame less than 4. It's on the startup layer. Line numbers are not necessarily relevant, but it said less than 3 initially, so it should say less than 4. So just back into how it should look by now. We should have all that stuff, and then we play the game. We should have shooting. We shoot at them, they shoot at us. We move around, but nobody hits each other. It's like a cartoon game where there are no injuries. We just get mad. So, and we should have a scoreboard section on the right. So let's talk about what to add next. And what we're going to do is we're going to be adding collisions. And the initial collisions we're concerned about are with the enemy ships hitting our ships. And that'll be a model for how we do the rest of our collisions. And so I want to show you something here. And there's a new object thing we're going to look at called hit test object. So hit test object is a method which attaches to specific objects. And so, for example, thing 1 might be a symbol, it might be player, it might be some object, it could be a single thing, and it just checks to see if this thing here is in collision with this thing here. So these two things should be separate, they should be different objects, and they should be instances. And the hit test object method just compares the overlap in the pixels of both objects to see if they're colliding. And what we need to do in case we have multiple objects, like we have a bunch of ships in a fleet, is we change that to say, okay, we do an array. So the array I, as we do with a loop, we would go through a loop, for loop, to say hit test object player to see if those objects are in collision with each other. So what we're going to do is first thing we need to do actually is save our project as a new version. So I think we're on version 6. So I'm going to say File, Save As. That's what we got to do. Save As, and I'm going to call this version 6. I've actually done this a couple times and got it wrong, so I'm going to call it Demo 2 because I made some mistakes. All right, so there's this one. So now we have this, and we're going to make a new layer. So our layers, just to talk about this, the code reads things from the top to the bottom. So when we look at these 4 layers here, it reads the vars first, startup second, player move. So for example, if I move the vars layer to the bottom, I'm going to have a whole bunch of issues. Don't do this at home, but notice that my splash screen winds up in the wrong place because it doesn't know what SSW and SSH are. So do I have errors for that? I don't even have errors. It's just like, I don't know, something weird. So it eventually comes up with it, but no errors. So I move this up, and now it's like, okay, I know what to do with that, right? There we go. So understanding that is important to understanding why we would take this in the next layer and drop it to the very bottom. So we're going to take this one, move it down, the new layer, and name this one collisions. Alright, so we also are going to need some other stuff. Let's see, let's start by doing an event check, or an add event listener. So an add event listener in this case is going to be, and let's put a comment in place, check for collisions with enemy fleet. The code actually doesn't know if you can spell or anything, but I like to write it legibly and have it make sense. So we say add event listener, event enter frame, collision check. This is a constant, ongoing, frame by frame thing, happens 24 times a second to get the job done. So what we're going to add next is the function definition for collision check, and we're going to say, okay, in this case we have this thing called collision check, and what it's going to do is check the whole fleet against player position. There we go. And so what we're going to use is a for loop, and the for loop uses a variable named I. Frequently it's I, you could call it whatever you want, but I is typically what's used. We use a colon there, not a semicolon like I goofed on there. So it's I, integer, and its value is equal to enemy fleet length. Now length is an object. It's a property of the object, and so it says how many objects are in that fleet at any given time. And it could be changing any time because, as we know, we're constantly adding new enemies to the screen and taking them off when they get to the end of the screen. So the variable is the value of how many are in there. Oh, and we need to subtract by 1. So if we subtract by 1, it's going to choose the last one by index because, as you know, the index is starting at 0. So if there's 5 objects in the fleet, the index of the last one would be 4 because 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and that's 5 objects. Kind of weird, I'll admit it. So I is the value, all values by greater than or equal to 0, and we're going to count backwards, I minus minus. Somehow I got an extra semicolon in there, and I'm just going to put some stuff in here. So I've got an extra curly bracket. Not a bad idea, as you can see that my other curly bracket went in the wrong place. There's a button right here at the top which allows me to reformat. It's a format code, and it just puts all the spaces and indents the way they should be. So if I run this, I should get 0 errors. Now, didn't happen that way. I got errors. Let's see. Some attribute is invalid. Let's double click on there and see what it got me. Enemy fleet.length. It's probably the value of enemy. Oh, I've got a underscore there. So always double check yourself. When you get an error, read the error and see what it means and see where it takes you. This one works. So what I don't have is I don't have feedback or any instructions for this particular loop. So what we're going to do inside the loop is we're going to use the hit test object. So we say if enemy fleet I, and that of course is the object we're dealing with. So one by one it goes to the enemy fleet I at a time, and it checks the hit test object against player or ship or whatever you have it called. You might want to double check and make sure you're using the right terms. So in my enemies here I have this thing called enemy fleet that matches up. In my player movement I have a new player object. I actually got instantiated in startup. So this should be player somewhere. There's player. So make sure they match. And now we say if that's true. Now notice I've got 1, 2 lefts and only 1 right. So I need to add that second right. 2 lefts and 2 rights. Left and right. Romeo and Juliet, always 2 together. So I take this. I guess if it was really Romeo and Juliet, there would be only one of them, huh? All right. Or they wind up, I don't know. Okay, forget it. Bad metaphor. So we're going to say if that's true, then we're going to create a thing called player death, which we haven't written yet. It's a function. So notice we're calling out this function with parentheses. This means that we have a function which we have not yet written. It has no listener. So usually we use an event listener or a button or a keyboard to create these things. This time it's just being called out inside of their function. So kind of a new way of going about things. So we say remove child, and we're going to say enemy fleet.I, or not .I, but I. So remove that from the stage. So out of sight, out of mind. That's just out of sight. Now we're going to say out of mind. So we say enemy fleet.splice, and we say I, comma 1. So it says take out this one, I. That's why we keep saying I. This I is one at a time. This is a specific one in the fleet. This is a specific one. It's removing this one, and it says take out 1. If you put 2 there, it'd screw things up completely. I dare you to try it. So that's all that does. Now if I run this, I'm going to get an error that says, hey man, you mentioned something, I don't know what it is. You said player death. I don't know what that is. So we have to write the player death. So just for kicks, we can actually write that real quick. So functions, move this up so you can see it up high on your screen. So we're going to write a function called player death. I think it was called player death, wasn't it? It wasn't enemy death. Right, it's player death. Function player death. And we do need to say void. There's no output from this, and we're going to say curly braces. And what this is going to do, it's going to be real quick. We're going to say lives minus minus and player.goTo and play frame 2. Now we have a couple things that are probably not going to work at this point, and we'll tell you why. We're going to get errors. So it says lives minus minus. It says the error says access of undefined property lives. That means that we called out something that does not exist. It's either a function or a variable. In this case, it's a variable. So we're going to go back to our variables layer and we're going to add that variable. So we're going to say var lives, and we start off with, you can make your own decision on this. Usually it's an odd number. You could say 3 or 5. I don't care. I'm going to go with 5. I went with 3 last time. Keep it mixed up. But this is how many lives your game should have at any given time. And this is kind of going to come into play later when we start doing scoreboard stuff. So you have some time to change your mind about this, but decide pretty soon how many lives you should go with, and run with it. Something else I feel like is missing, and I can't remember what it is. Let's go back to the function I just wrote. So we said, oh yeah, player.goTo and play2. So in this case, it's going to work sort of, but when it dies, when it gets wrecked, let's try this through there. So it's going to go boom, and nothing happens. So the reason that happens is there's actually nothing in frame 2. So if we open up this object, the player, where is he? There he is, alphabetical. So what this needs to have is more frames, and the purpose of the more frames is to create an explosion and a pause and a respawning or a resetting. So I'm not sure if this is how the pros do it, but it works for me. So I'm going to go to frame 2, push F7. There it is. And I'm going to turn on my onion skinning. So yours may look different, but there should be a row of these buttons on yours somewhere. Edit multiple frames. No onion skin outlines would work, or onion skin regular. So either of these two is just fine. Whatever is more visible for you. You're going to want to get the brush tool. So I got B for brush. And you're going to want to paint up an explosion. So there is a button in properties maybe, or it could be at the bottom of the tools panel. Hard to say on your version. I'm not sure how different we are on this. I'm pretty sure I've got 2020. You may have 2019. I'm not sure. So this is my home machine. So I'm going to use this brush. I'm going to go poof, poof, poof. Actually, let's see. Let's get that opened. And let me make it bigger. So sometimes just quick pop, pop, pop. Too big still. Let's go a little smaller. Just going to make a little explosion like that. And I'm going to add some yellow to it with bright yellow, smaller brush. Okay, that's pretty good. So we could get as fancy as that with that as we want. You can also just push F6 and use the free transform tool, which is this one here, and we can rotate this and scale it and tweak it around all we want. We can be as lazy as we choose to be when we make this design. So here's this, and I'm going to choose F6 again. F6, get the free transform tool, rotate it. And the way an explosion kind of works is it forces all this energy and matter outward, and then it sucks back in on itself, so it kind of gets small again. So I'm going to take this keyframe and Alt drag it over, and then F6 that one more time. And if it looks weird there, it's because my end skinning is on. So if I look at this, it goes gaboosh, right? I'm going to get one smaller piece, maybe F6, and shrink it down. And you could repaint each frame. You get as wild as you want to with your explosion, but recommend you don't get too huge with it, and recommend that you do that. So what we need to have next is just test that. So now as it does this, it's actually going to loop through all those frames. Now the one problem that's created by that is we need to go back into an earlier version, or not an earlier version, but back into our scene 1. So player does this, back into startup, and let's look at our code. So in startup, when the player gets placed on the stage, it just says here's the position, X, Y, and it says player visible as false. We're also going to need to add that player dot go to and stop frame 1. So now when it plays, it's on the screen, it's going to stop on that first frame. So we don't even know it's going to explode until it actually does. It's terrifying. Boom! But now it just keeps exploding over and over and over again. It's kind of irritating. So let's go back into the symbol itself. Library, open it up, and let's see what we're going to do here. So let's move this over for a second. And what we need to have is an empty frame here. So that's F7, or right click, insert blank keyframe. It's F7. And we're going to have an empty frame for maybe 2 seconds or a second and a half. So that's just a pause time. It's kind of like a get your life back together, get your thoughts together while the world respawns itself and everything cools off. So we're going to say, let's see, how many seconds is that? 48 seconds. So this is frame 6, I think. It says right there frame 6. So if I say that plus 48 is 54, I'm going to go to frame 55 just for fun, and I'm going to push F6 or F7. The whole goal here is to have nothing for this whole stretch of time. So I've got empty keyframes until we get to there where we're going to add some code. So this code is inside the player, so we're going to refer to things a little bit differently. And we're just going to say, here's the code. This is inside the player. And it says this dot go to and stop one, so it's resetting it back to frame and stopping it there so it doesn't just keep looping through the explosion, which is horrifying. And we say this, which is the object itself, that's the player, is x is going to equal stage width divided by 2. The reason we can't say SSW and SSH here is because SSW is another timeline. Doesn't work here. Alright. So, yeah, I misspelled that. You're right. You should probably make that right. The code doesn't care, but I do. So spelling should be good. So it's going to reset now. I feel like I may have had a mistake, but maybe I don't. Alright, let's see what happens. Jaboom! And it comes back. Now it came back kind of at the wrong place. So let's work on that math a little bit. So stage height minus this dot height. Let's maybe say minus 2 times this dot height. Let's try that. Okay, so we're going to hit it and get exploded. 1 1000, 2 1000, and it's still showing up too low. I'm not sure why that is. Let's see what's going on here. This dot x, maybe that has to be separate. Okay, so I need to have a space between those symbols, because what I noticed is that when I added a space that those colors changed. So that should work now, and it's probably going to wind up in the wrong place. Kaboom! You can add a sound effect later. Okay, it's still showing up at the bottom. Anyway, you may have some issues with that as we move forward. Minus 2 times this. What if I switch this around? So everything is, when you're doing code, is problem solving, and there's always an issue. So I'm not afraid to show that that happens here also. And we're just going to try to keep coming up with what's the solution on this. Boom. And comes back, still showing up down below somewhere. So I'm not sure if you can see that actually below my frame, but it's showing up right here. So something's going on. And also the middle position of the screen is altered because of my scoreboard position. Those are all issues we can work with. You could also just hard code the Y and the X if you want to. So let's say I just change this number to like 300, and maybe I make this number, I'm just going to guess, I can't remember what the size of my game is, but I'm going to change this to 400. So try some stuff out. You kind of have to mess with it until it works, and that's going to go there, and he blows up, and now he's showing up too high on the screen. Anyways, you kind of can work with that as you go, and that's actually killing the player. So, and he comes back. So it's also, what's missing still is we need to go back to collisions, and we need to add to this. Lives minus minus is working. So you might just add a value for this. We might say trace lives every time it gets blown up. And we also want to stop the enemies from showing up. So that's part of the respawning process there. So enemies says function new enemy playing. Okay, so what we want to be able to do is set playing to false during that time. So if the player gets killed, we lose playing. We're going to set playing to false, and that will stop the ships and the enemies from showing up. So there we go. So now this is actually going to be kind of semi-permanent, theoretically. And now there's no more ships showing up. Yes, they are. So I think when the player shows up again, that somehow it's resetting the player ships. So every time the player shows up again, we should have ships. And frankly, I'm not sure what I did to make that work properly, but when the player disappears and respawns, it works. So we may have to come back and remedy that later, but that's pretty much the scoop for player collisions.